right, people, raise your hand if you're ready to start a new unit. I can't tell if you're raising your hand. So, Ancient Egypt, here we go. And we are kicking off our Ancient Egyptian unit by first talking about the lifeblood of Ancient Egypt and even Egypt today, and that is the Nile River. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information about that. So, just like Mesopotamia, Egypt develops when a group of nomads get to Egypt and they're like, this has great fertile soil, natural resources, good places for shelter, clean drinking water, not a lot of danger. Let's set up shop here. So this group of nomads learn how to farm, grow wheat and barley, and also eventually how to write. The Egyptian civilization does last longer than Mesopotamia, and you're going to see the reason why. Egypt's going to have some protection from nature that Mesopotamia doesn't have. The Mesopotamians like to fight each other a lot, like you learned in the unit. Sargon conquered things, Hammurabi conquered things. Egypt, for a good chunk of its history, is united. They are rich, and they are powerful. Now, before I go any further, let's just make sure we know where Egypt is. So I'm going to zoom out on a little map of the world. Look there. There we are. Hi, everybody. So now I'll zoom back in. So Mesopotamia is over here in what is today Iraq. Egypt is Egypt. Right here in Africa. Egypt's an African nation. And they're right over here. And if you notice on this kind of map, see all this green right here? That is the fertile soil along the Nile River. And that's going to be really important. All right. So the Nile River flows 4,145 miles from the mountains of Central Africa to the Mediterranean Sea. And let me show you where that is. There are mountains over here in Central Africa, around Uganda or so, and Lake Victoria over here. And the very weird thing about the Nile River that makes it kind of unique from a lot of rivers the mountains are up here. The lowlands are here. So the Nile River actually flows from south to north. This is the end of the Nile River. This is the beginning of the Nile River. I know normally we're used to in North America. Here, let's travel across the world, shall we? Well, in North America, we're used to like, oh, there's mountains here and this land's lower, so the rivers always go this way. Well, that's not how it is all over the world. There's the mountains here, the lowlands are here, the Nile River flows this way. This is the end of the Nile River. All right. Now, the Nile River is, as I said, a river that flows from south to north. It's because of the mountains in Central Africa that are at a higher elevation. And let me explain these two things because it's super confusing. Lower Egypt is actually in the north. This is Lower Egypt because, like I said, this is the end of the river. The land is of a lower elevation. And this is Upper Egypt because they're not talking about like direction, north and south. They're talking about high up land. So let's get a little closer. So here we have Upper Egypt because it's talking about the land being higher up. And here we have Lower Egypt. So in the notes, as I wrote, Lower Egypt's in the northern part of Egypt. That is this part right here, Lower Egypt. And it's because the land is lower than the other parts of Egypt. And Upper Egypt's in the southern part because the land is higher. So again, Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt, because the Nile River flows this way and this land is higher up than this land. Very different from the United States. The Nile River is also the longest river in the world. It beats out the Amazon River in South America by about 200 miles. Now, there's a little controversy among the people that study rivers because the Nile River is the longest river in mileage, but it's not the biggest river in size of water. That is the Amazon, because there's parts of the Amazon that are much wider and there's parts of the Nile that are much more narrow. So when you say, like, what river is the biggest? Well, it depends. If we're talking about length, that's the Nile River. If we're talking about width, that's the Amazon River in South America, which is, I'll show you. Zoom out. Amazon River is over here in South America. All right, so let's come back into Egypt. All right, next. The river cuts a narrow, green, fertile valley through the desert of Egypt, and you can see that really well here. We can see this green. In fact, I'll zoom out. You can still see this green. Like, look at that. That's the end of the Nile River. Very, 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 very fertile soil. So there you can see right there in Lower Egypt. All right. Now, before the river reaches the sea, it forms a fan-shaped area of fertile land called a delta. So I'm going to try and zoom in here to see if we can see this fan-shaped area. Let me zoom in a little more. Oh, no, I didn't want to do that. Oh, if you're wondering, obviously we see the English, and then underneath, this is Arabic because that's the language they speak in Egypt today. So we can see a little bit of the fan-shaped area. I'm going to get a better map to show you that, like, really fan-shaped appearance. Let's check it out together, shall we? Yeah, this is much better. So here we go. Do we see how this looks like a fan? So when the Nile River gets to the end, it becomes a fan shape like this. And this is called the delta. So the end of the Nile River in Lower Egypt is called the delta. And look at all that fertile soil. Tons. All right. Most ancient Egyptians live near the delta, which should not surprise you that most of them live here. And on this map, it's here. And even today in Egypt, 95% of Egyptians live along the banks of the Nile River. It's where all their major cities are because there's deserts and stuff. And we'll talk about that different geography in a couple minutes. So most ancient Egyptians live near the delta. And here's the interesting thing about Egypt, and this is why they get to last so long. Geography protects them for a really long time. The desert, the sea, the river, waterfalls, and mountains all form something called cataracts. That's this word here. A cataract is when geography and nature protect you from getting invaded by enemies. So, if I go back to this map, you'll see. So, the Egyptians live along the banks of the Nile River here. If somebody was going to invade them from the west, they'd have to cross the Sahara Desert. That's not going to happen. If someone was going to invade them from the east here, they'd have to cross mountains. If they're going to invade this way, they'd have to cross the Sinai Desert. If they're going to invade this way, it's the Red Sea. If they're going to follow the Nile River and go up, there's tons of waterfalls there that would totally damage their boats. And if they're going to invade this way, they'd have to cross the Mediterranean Sea. So geography protects ancient Egypt for a while. Eventually, you're going to learn is groups of people learn to build things like chariots that can make it through certain things. But for a good long while, Egypt's living the good life. They have geography to protect them. They're united and rich. All right. Now, every year in the middle of July, the Nile River floods. And what that flood meant was lots of fertile soil for the Egyptians to grow crops. So every year there was a flood. And the reason for it, let me zoom out again. The reason for it is the mountains in Central Africa here are snow capped. In the middle of July, it's super hot. That snow's going to melt. Just like when we learned about the Tigris and Euphrates River, the snow capped mountains in Turkey melted that flooded Tigris and Euphrates. Every July floods the Nile River, and it's a massive flood. So, Egyptian farmers would plant their crops when the flood waters receded, that means went away, and the soil was still wet. To water the crops during the dry seasons, the Egyptians made huge bowl-shaped holes called basins to store the water. And I'm going to show you here. Let's get another picture going here. Egyptian basin. Let's see if that gives me a good picture of a basin. Yeah, it does here. So if we see over here, this basin, it's almost like a reservoir to store water. So it's a big hole to store water here that they would use when they need it. And they used something called a shadoof. Now, a shadoof is a super interesting word because it sounds like you're making fun of someone. Like if you call someone a shadoof, that sounds like a horrible insult. But it's an Egyptian water machine where you can get water from the Nile to eventually go to the basins. And I'm going to show you just a little clip of this cartoon video that's going to do a really good job of showing you a Shadoof. Oh, I had this all queued up. Look at me. I had it all queued up, ready to go, and my computer...
The importance of the River Nile in ancient Egypt, 3100 through 30 BC. The River Nile...
Hold on. As you can tell, I'm not editing this. You get me and all my mistakes that I'm doing this. So let me get to the Shadoof part. Here it is. Okay. Now, I also don't want to hear the person talking. I also don't want coupons. So, although maybe I do want coupons, I don't know. All right, so this is a Shadoof. So it's a really interesting machine that they make. And Shadoofs are still used in some parts of the world. There's some parts of India where they still use Shadoofs. And it's a machine where you put the bucket down into the water, into the Nile, and then it goes into this little canal that'll eventually go into the basin, which is that storing thing. So you can see it working just like that. There you go. Shadoof in progress. Making it easier so you don't have to keep bending, and this is just technology gets better. Oh, and this is eventually this video goes into trade. So this is an Egyptian, and this person is from a land to the south called Nubia, and we'll talk more about Nubia later on in the Egyptian unit. So that was a Shadoof in action. Now, Shadoof, that water machine I said, sounds like an insult. So if you have an older sibling that had me for social studies, I have a challenge for you. And this is the challenge. I want you to call your older sibling a Shadoof. Just go up to them and be like, hey, you're a Shadoof. And see what they say. See if they're like, I know, that's Mr. Gujik, the water machine. Or if they call you a Shadoof back. Now, you can only do this if you have older siblings. I'm going to tell you why. Younger siblings, you're going to get yourself in trouble. Because, like, second and third graders, they don't understand. They'll be like, they call me a Shadoof. They don't know what's going on. The older students that have me, it's like a rite of passage to call them a Shadoof. And then tell me what happens. See if they remember what a Shadoof is. All right. Now, the Egyptians grew wheat, barley, and grapes, along with some other crops. So, the Nile River is to Egypt what the Tigris and the Euphrates were to the Mesopotamians. Super important, and that's why we start off our unit talking about the Nile.